There's tension between Israel's prime minister and his intelligence gatekeepers as the battle to bring the hostages back home continues. It's a bumper episode because it's also Purim, and we are speaking to perhaps the most exciting comedian of his generation. Alex Edelman joins us on Unholy. I'm Jonathan Friedland in London.
And I'm Yonit Levy in Tel Aviv. Unholy, two Jews on the news. It's Purim. You know it's my favorite holiday. I know it's not yours, but I mean, it's Purim, and we're trying to, sprinkle a little bit of cheer. So as you said, Alex Edelman is with us, and he's a comedic genius, and we'll talk to him later. We needed
You've got to stay, by the way. Listeners have to stay for that, because they've got to get to the bit where he talks through which Chagim, which Jewish holidays are Jewish and which are not. And you are going to be very surprised by which Jewish holidays do not make the Jewish cut. So stay for that.
Really, please do. We sprung this on him unprepared, and he just went on a whole riff on what Jewish holidays are not Jewish. And you really want to stay for that because it will make you feel better, as will the whole conversation. We have a lot of other news before that, of course, but we also have to mention that it's Purim. And, I have been long telling you that my youngest daughter, there's only one costume that she was attached to forever and ever, which is, of course,
from Frozen, Elsa.
Thank you. Every year I tell this to you, and I hope that maybe at some point it will make you see Frozen, but it hasn't yet.
Not yet, no. But has she graduated from the Elsa
There is
costume?
a dramatic shift this year. This is breaking news. This is what I'm trying to report to you. She chose a whole different costume.
Unreal.
And she went as a policewoman, which means, I just see the headline, princess retired, turns to law enforcement. But really, she kind of made that decision. And I think it's more than anything sort of indicative of, what this year has been like here. And obviously, this holiday all about costumes and about cheer, but again, under the shadow of the war. So it doesn't surprise me that you see these more and more these costumes of, the soldiers, the policemen, all of that. So a little less princess and a little more of that kind of thing.
So first, Donald Trump upends the entire post-war order after 8 decades, and now your daughter chooses a new Purim costume. There is nothing for me to hold on to anymore. The world is just too fluid and in flux all the time. Before we leave Purim, we should mention to our listeners, if you want to go to our Patreon, there is the promo code for Purim. So you can sign up. It's a very good time to sign up as a friend or family member of the podcast. You go to patreon.com/unholypod and enter the code Purim25. It's been mentioned to me that's because it is the year 2025. I hadn't quite picked up on that. Purim25, and that will give you an astonishing 50% off your first month. You did not know that we were business leaders, you and me, Yonit, but there it is.
We didn't know it either.
We didn't. It's news to us. 50% off your first month if you enter the Purim code, Purim25, or rather the promo code, but these words are all turning into a blur. Anyway, very, very good. So that it is Purim. What better way to celebrate than becoming a friend of Unholy or a family member of Unholy? Promo code Purim25. So how is Purim where you are? I know, by the way, I'll just briefly mention this. You'll hear the voice still a little bit croaky and raspy, but I'm hopefully back in business. Our thanks to David Remnick sitting in this chair last week. But if you hear the odd miniature frog rather than bullfrog, that's because not everything has fully come back. But just fill us in with how Purim is being marked, given the politics that's going on. There is a backdrop to Purim this year, obviously.
Yeah, well, as we said, it's the Purim in the shadow of the war. Hostages are still in Gaza, very tense security period. So the interesting thing is that parents around the country get these guidelines, right? No fake guns. Kids can't come with their faces covered. You have to know how to, the sort of guard in the entrance of the schools has to know how to recognize the children. You got all these kinds of things, and a heartbreaking moment is that many Israeli kids are going as Batman. That is to pay respect to Ariel Bibas, who was murdered by Hamas and with his mother and his brother. This was his favorite costume. So that is sort of something you see a lot in the streets this year. Obviously, all of this trickling into the Purim holiday. You have families of hostages coming to the Knesset with a mishloach manot, the traditional sort of varied foods that you're supposed to bring as a present. But this time what they brought is a quarter of a pita, which is the, as hostages would say when they came out of captivity, this is the only food they got for a day and sometimes for more. So all of this, of course, connecting into the conversation that is still the main conversation in Israel this week as well. The chances of a hostage deal, it does look a little bit more optimistic. It does look like what the mediating countries will succeed in bringing is a deal that will say right now, bring back a few hostages. They're not saying the number, but it's less than 10, and extend the ceasefire for a few weeks. The person I was talking to today said to me, look, this is a win-win. The mediating countries get this progress going and more hostages out. Israel gets more hostages out. The Hamas gets an extended ceasefire. And I said, yes, it's win-win for everything, but everyone but the hostages who need to get home urgently. So this is where it stands at this point regarding the issue of the hostages. We should say the stories of these hostages coming out. People like Omer Venkert, who was in captivity for 505 days, telling about the torture, about being beaten, about, being sprayed by bug spray, all these kind of terrible, sadistic things that he went through after 505 days. 205 of those days were in total solitude. And this is a man who's, he's young. He's a young man. He's standing up. He says, I don't want revenge. I just want to live my life. These are remarkable Israelis. And you hear these stories a little bit more as they're coming out.
You mentioned the negotiations that are ongoing. I think diminished faith, less faith now than there was a week ago in Donald Trump's specially appointed envoy for this, Adam Bowler, who I know spoke to you. He's given a series of interviews and has not endeared himself kind of to anybody because of this, just a sort of confusion that he has. At one point talking about Israelis who are held by Hamas as, quote, prisoners, describing prisoners held by Israel as hostages, talking at one point having to issue some clarification because he had very much looked as if he'd said that they were nice guys that he was talking to.
He doesn't have horns. They don't have horns, he said to Jake Tapper.
They don't have horns. I mean, we're going to, later on when we talk to Alex Edelman, we're going to talk about the business of seeing the human in an enemy and all that, but you don't do it glibly and facetiously, I think, like that. You don't stumble into it. So I think, those people who felt as if the Americans are the people who hold the key to these talks, some of their confidence was dented by this envoy who, took it upon himself to, or got the backing, but talked to Hamas directly. Hugely controversial thing to do. Obviously, much more confidence in Steve Witkoff, the specially appointed envoy, close friend of Donald Trump, who has so far received high marks for his conduct of the talks, and particularly his relationship with the hostage families. But that's a sort of subplot to these ongoing talks that you mentioned, and a lot of people are pinning some, at least interim, provisional hopes that they might bear some fruit.
Yes, it's a subplot, this curious case of Adam Bowler and his direct negotiations with Hamas. It's a subplot, but it is indicative of what kind of administration the Trump administration is, right? It will do whatever it thinks is the right thing to do, even the transactional sort of decision to make and say, you know what, this is unprecedented that the United States will directly talk. A representative of the president will sit with Hamas, give them this huge gift and not get anything in return. The Israelis really didn't like this. By the way, in one of the interviews he talked about, so what if Ron Dermer was upset? But it shows Israelis, this is an administration that does what it wants. And right now, these direct negotiations with Hamas were shut down. It doesn't mean they won't open up again. Two things to notice.
Perhaps with someone else doing them.
Yes, perhaps. That could be. Two things to notice that are happening in Israel, and we should just sort of turn the focus of our listeners to that. One is that it does look like Netanyahu is cruising. Well, I don't know if cruising through, but will manage to pass his budget at the end of March. As we spoke about this a lot, that means that the main obstacle that he could have, that his government might have shattered on, is now will be moved aside, and he can perhaps be the prime minister until the original date of the elections at the end of 2026, which is quite really mind-boggling when you think of the catastrophe that is October 7th. There are still things that could, shake this boat, particularly if Trump comes along with his Saudi plan, which of course will throw Netanyahu into a lot of trouble with his own coalition. But that means that he is pretty safe, or much more safe than he was thus far. The other thing to notice is, of course, the story been dubbed here Qatargate, the investigation into Netanyahu's aides and their alleged aid to Qatar as well. While working close in the Prime Minister's office, the Attorney General ordered an investigation into that connection. And a gag order this week has been slapped on this whole story. What we should notice about this is that the head of the Israeli security agency, Shin Bet, Israel's internal security service, which is investigating this man is named Ronen Bar. He is head-to-head with the Prime Minister on this, and the tensions between these two men is rising. Netanyahu can technically fire him. I mean, the government can directly fire him. Netanyahu can't do that right now because, as I said, his aides are investigated, so that's a conflict of interest. But this sort of I don't want to say mutual assured destruction, but this sort of balance of this threat on both sides is very dramatic. The man who entered the scene on Thursday evening is Nadav Argaman, Ronen Bar's predecessor, the former head of Shin Bet. In an interview he gave to me, let's say, understatement of the century, not a Netanyahu supporter. He says Netanyahu shouldn't be the one to appoint Ronen Bar's replacement. Just think, he says, what Netanyahu can do with this kind of security agency if he appoints someone who is his yes man, really not mincing words in this way. He's also talking about the Qatargate, and he says, I know Netanyahu, if anything was happening in his office, he would know about it. And the fact that he's not the first one to call for an investigation tells you something. In the height of the interview, he says something very, very clear. He says, I know things about Netanyahu. I know things from my work as head of Shin Bet. If I think that the Prime Minister decides to act against the law, if he decides to break the law, I will not have a choice, and I will tell everything. I will say everything I know. So that is a pretty clear smoking gun put on the table. Of course, responses from the Prime Minister's office coming soon after that. But this is where we are in that kind of tension between Netanyahu and his intelligence gatekeepers, former and current.
Yeah, don't make me angry. You won't like me when I'm angry, to quote the Incredible Hulk. Sounds like the message from Nadav Argaman. I mean, immediately now, obviously, he's going to make every journalist in the country thinking, what is it he knows that he's not letting on? I mean, he's holding that weapon there. It's very hard to keep that sort of sheathed permanently now that you've told people it's there. There's obviously something he's specifically holding on to. As for the budget, some people might think this is a coping mechanism on my part. For a long time, I have assumed that Netanyahu will just be there, that he's not going to be unseated ahead of time. As you said, it's extraordinary to think about it, given October 7th. After that day, people were saying it was days or weeks that Netanyahu could stay in. No, he manages to always outlast those people who think his days are numbered. Like I've said before, I think best to imagine he's going to be Prime Minister until he's 90. And then if he isn't, think of it as a bonus. But until then, my working assumption is nothing is getting that guy out of that chair. He's in for a very long time, and this point about the budget helps him. On the international front, two developments I think worth noting, and they're sort of related. The first one is the United Nations Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory. It's a body that the Human Rights Council of the UN set up a long time ago, delivered a very, very, scathing report exposing or accusing Israel of what it calls the systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other gender-based violence in its war with Hamas in the Gaza Strip. It says that it has documented in minute detail allegations and evidence of crimes, which it says will be aid the genocide case against Israel at the International Court of Justice. Immediately, Prime Minister Netanyahu's lashed out at the body which sort of stands above this Commission of Inquiry, namely the Human Rights Council of the UN, condemned it as an anti-Israel circus, long been exposed as anti-Semitic, rotten, terrorist-supporting and irrelevant, says Netanyahu. And the Human Rights Council does indeed have a very almost comically checkered history. There were periods when Colonel Gaddafi's Libya was, I think, chairing it, Iran, Saudi Arabia, all kinds of violent, North Korea, And they've got this sort of standing interest in, some would call it fixation with, Israel. So, easy for them to dismiss this. The evidence that the so-called or the members of the body have assembled, I think, people will want to take a look at that. I would just make one point, which is there are a lot of people who I think are very, very quick to dismiss anything put out by the UN as immediately tainted, and just as Netanyahu has just done then. I would just say one thing about that. If you're in the court of public opinion, it's quite difficult to cherry pick which UN reports you like and which you don't like. And I mention that because, back in March of last year, a lot of people in Israel were entirely, understandably, very gratified when a UN Special Envoy on Sexual Violence, Pramila Patan, reported clear and convincing information that Hamas were guilty of rape and sexualized torture in their crimes perpetrated on October the 7th. And a lot of people said, look, there's the UN now saying it. It's hard to people are not going to be quick to understand why that UN was legitimate and important and reliable, and this UN can be dismissed as an anti-Israel circus and tainted. I've made the distinction between the Human Rights Council and the rest of the UN, but I think if you're making that argument out there in public opinion, it's quite difficult to cherry pick. Either the UN is entirely discredited and tainted, including the bits you like, or it isn't. And it's just hard to be that selective, I think.
The thing he said, he was answering Israel's allegations, and he said this: the bottom line is, it's all lies. They clearly do not read our documents, and clearly they have an agenda they pursue. And I thought, that's an interesting projection. I really think so. Look, I'm talking about the report itself, and the fact that they admit that there is no proof of intent on committing genocide, which means that this report is partially baked. And so it begs the question, why was it, released to the world at all? The things that they talk about are things that should be obviously checked. I mean, they talk about the bombing of a fertility clinic. They talk about things like that. They said that young men and men were held when they were naked. Obviously, I didn't see, at least in what I managed to read from the report, any mention of the fact that happens. First of all, that Israel apologized for these cases, but also that happened to begin with because they were suspected of terrorist activities. What I'm zooming out, and this connects to your, I think, point about can you take parts of what the UN is saying and not parts of the other? And I think that what's important to see here is the view, again, zooming out, of what is being done here in general. If you want to minimize what Hamas did on October 7th, what you mentioned, the sexual torture and the rape. If you want to minimize that, you do two things. One is you ignore that happened, right? I remind our listeners that it took months and months for the UN to even investigate what Hamas did on October 7th. It took the outcry of Americans, of Jews around the world, and of brave journalists for the UN to even look into this story. And the other thing that you do is what Sam Harris would call the sin of moral equivalence. You try and say, oh, look, Israel is guilty of this as well. And if anyone is reading this report and thinks that this is in any way, similar to what Hamas did, I think it's pretty clear that it's not. So what I would say, is it's important to read these reports. I don't think that this should be ignored. And if Israel did something wrong, it should. But you have to be able to distinguish between a terror organization set out to murder, kidnap, and rape innocent civilians and country conducting war. So that is the thing I will say. I think we completely ruined the Purim mode. I apologize, but I think that this should be mentioned.
Well, and I did mention at the start that there was a second development which I wanted to relate to it because I think it's connected, and that was the decision. It's nearly a week ago now on Sunday, Israel ordering all of Gaza's electricity supply to be cut off.
The parts that Israel supplies.
Sure. Yes. I mean, all the electricity that Israel supplies to Gaza to be cut off. Energy Minister Eli Cohen doing that a week after cutting off all aid. And Cohen said, we will use all the tools at our disposal to pressure Hamas to release hostages. The point I would make is, if you go back to the case that's being made at the two international courts, and look, a lot of people in Israel might just think, who cares about those courts? Donald Trump's got our back. We don't care about the ICC or the ICJ. Either of them doesn't matter. But if you do care about those, one of the key arguments was that aid or electricity, basics, vital supplies, were being used as tools, as weapons. And Israel for a long time was saying, no, it's not. Of course not. We're doing everything absolutely by the book. There you have the words of the energy minister saying, we will use all the tools at our disposal. If I was Eli Cohen's lawyer, I would be saying to him, that could be a problem, those words. You've then admitted that you're not making decisions about aid or electricity purely on the grounds of supply and humanitarian need. You're making those decisions as tools to pressure Hamas, even though, of course, for example, with electricity, the consequence will be the desalination plants that therefore affects the supply of clean water, which won't just affect Hamas, it will affect everyone. That is, if you've got one eye on the case that is being made against Israel, which is that it is using these things as weapons of war and directed at civilians, not distinguishing Hamas, Eli Cohen has just handed a great gift to those people making those criticisms. And that's even before you get into what I think is the foolhardiness of doing this, because all it does is it turns the population even more against Israel, and also the morality of it. I think if you're affecting the supply of clean water, that's not a tool you should use, I think. But anyway, those two things I think we are linked. We'll make a final mention just because we won't have time to get into it all, but a lot of people will be closely watching this case of Mahmoud Khalil, a graduate activist at Columbia University. He's foreign born. He was there in the country with a green card. His leave to remain, as it were, in the United States has been terminated because of his political activities at Columbia University. Again, I think a lot of people will be feeling a sort of sugar rush. Glad to see the back of this guy, one of a group of protesters who, by all accounts, were essentially parroting Hamas talking points. I was hearing about people handing out leaflets and wearing stuff, Sinwar's face on it. Nobody likes the sound of this guy. Nevertheless, bad precedent being set here, which is that if you are a foreign national, your place in the country is conditional on your political views. Just remember J.D. Vance going to Munich and Europe, lecturing everyone there about freedom of speech. Here is somebody whose ability to remain in the country. He was there legally as a legal resident, being terminated because of his views. To stress, we find these views heinous and disgusting. But if you believe in free speech, it is the free speech for people to say things you do find heinous.
But is it only an issue of free speech, I wonder? I mean, I know we're not getting into this week.
Yeah, they're not. The argument, yes. No, very much. The statute that Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, is using, this 1952 statute, I looked at this. It's about expressing views which are at odds with or could undermine the foreign policy of the United States. It's not a terrorism charge. I mean, in this country, in Britain, it would be giving aid or succor to terrorism. You'd get him on that. But here they're saying if it's clashes with or undermines the foreign policy of the United States. So let me give you a hypothetical. What if there is a Ukrainian who is legally resident in the United States who starts making the case for Ukraine's independence? Donald Trump is all in, let's say, with Vladimir Putin and no longer advancing Ukraine. We saw what he did with Zelensky. You could imagine him saying, your position here is at odds with the foreign policy of the United States. You're out. And there will be others who say, well, look, these people are foreign. It's not affecting US citizens. We've got a US administration that wants to look again at birthright citizenship. I just wouldn't be that confident that this isn't, they've picked here a case of someone who would attract very little sympathy to begin a precedent which says your position in the country is contingent on your views being congenial to the Trump administration. That is not a position anybody, I would say not particularly American Jews, would not want to embrace. And a lot of American Jews, to their credit, are expressing disquiet about it.
Yes, obviously this is an argument that's trickling into American jury as well. And it is an issue. There are so many questions here. The question is, again, do you charge someone with a crime? Is the crime, again, under that freedom of speech, or is it about, violent takeovers of university buildings and, spreading terrorist propaganda? Again, he hasn't been charged with this, but the question is, if he had been, would that make a difference? If it was just a student visa, not a green card, would that make a difference? And of course, if he was someone who was not attacking Jews in Israel, but anywhere else, would that also make a difference? It's obviously a change of policy, and it's obviously something that the Trump administration has thought to tackle. By the way, this is a real problem, of course, and we have been talking about it, right? The crisis of higher education, what has been going on in campuses. It is a question if this is the right way to deal with it.
Yeah, and I think this just underlines, by the way, a small point, but the extent to which Israel-Palestine, partly because of the student protests and so on, has become a kind of culture war issue, separate from other foreign policy issues, for Donald Trump and for sort of MAGA. And this just underlines that they know this one case will be extremely popular with their base. And I think you can see why they would pick this if this was, a first foray into a change.
We will circle back to this issue in the next couple of episodes, but now we really want to take a breath and give you, I think, what we can call our Purim gift, because it really is the central conversation of this week that has a lot of funny moments and a lot of other moments, insightful ones. And let's hear it.
Alex Edelman is a writer, actor, and comedian. His show, Just for Us, was a huge hit on Broadway. It became an HBO special and won an Emmy for outstanding writing to go along with the special Tony Award it won. He has been named by Time magazine among its 100 influential people for 2024. He's basically a very big star. Alex, welcome to Unholy.
Wow, I already have so many quibbles from that. But
really quibble away, go on.
I don't think I'm a big star, but I'm very pleased to be here. Let's end the quibbles.
Okay, we can quibble about the degree of stardom. So, Jewish comedians and Jewish American comedians, it's a whole genre. People could write big doctorates and big books about it. But a lot of them are from New York. A lot of them are even from Brooklyn, New York. Lots has been talked about that. You're from Brookline, Massachusetts. How
Indeed.
Are Boston Jews different from New York Jews, and how does that affect you comedically, if it does?
There are fewer. There are fewer of them. There are fewer of them, Jonathan. There are much fewer Bostonian Jews, which means we have a paucity of kosher restaurants. We don't really have many kosher restaurants in Boston, so it's sort of like Tel Aviv in that regard. You can't find any kosher food anywhere, but you've got to go to Tedder and ask for the no pepperoni on your pizza.
This is why it was important to create the Jewish state. That's important.
That's right. I remember I was in Tel Aviv and it was late at night, and I said, "Where can I find kosher food?" They're like, "Now." Now?
Try in the morning.
But yeah, I loved growing up in Boston. I can't speak too much to Bostonian or even Bostonian Jews writ large, but in my enclave of modern Orthodoxy, I was very happy with what I grew up with and was very, very, very centered between the modern world and the Orthodox one in a way that was not an accident, that was almost a compulsion, which is how do you figure out a life in a sort of external world led by the values and traditions of your very, very ancient faith. So, and whereas New Yorkers, they have quite a few delis. No, sorry, I don't know how to distinguish New Yorkers from Bostonian Jews. I think of us as sort of like a northernmost enclave of New York or East Coast Jewry, given that every summer camp I went to was, Boston Jews and New York Jews. And I'd say that every Jewish camp, the good kind, every Jewish camp, sorry.
You went there already.
Yeah, already.
A few minutes in.
Yes, every Jewish camp has this, I think, mixture of, on the East Coast, has this mixture of Boston Jews and New York Jews and Pennsylvania Jews and, mainline Jews. But it's a long answer in saying I'm not sure or not very much, I guess.
I'm going to drag you into another question of distinction, which is the difference between Jewish humor and Israeli humor. We had Muli Segev on, who's the creator of Israel's, Saturday Night Live, Eretz Nehederet, and he said, listen, obviously we all know, right, we're all Jews, we know that laughter is for curing anxiety and fear. It's an old Israeli secret, an old Jewish secret, but Israeli humor is much more brutal and raw and not PC because we deal with harsher realities. Would you agree?
I would say that if sensitive humors were inanimate objects, Israeli humor is a hammer, and American Jewish humor is a telescope that largely looks only into the past. When I watch Israeli comedy, I find in lots of instances, and not all of them, there are many exceptions and some very good ones, but I find that his subtlety does not play well on Israeli television. And I would say that for Americans, Jewish comedy doesn't have the urgency that Israeli stuff has. I think because of that, or at least the perception of that, means that Israelis are much more, and I think American Jews still trying to determine their identity sometimes struggle to create art that seems pressing. By the way, the reason for that is I think that obviously there are valences to the Israeli experience, but because the American Jewish experience is so non-monolithic, it can be very hard to create something that is representative of that Jewish experience. And I would say that I think Israelis have an experience that's much more unified than Jews in the United States. Their opinions are largely, in my opinion, a little bit more homogenous. Their cultural understandings aren't as diffuse. And so I think because of that, Israelis, you can have an easier time, I think, as a comic in Israel making sort of popular comedy than you can as a Jewish comedian in the United States making comedy for a Jewish constituency. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, and the thing I was going to link the two questions in a way, where I've often wondered about this, about being majorities and being minorities, right? So partly what was going on in my question about New York and Boston is I think of New York Jewish humor is that it has a kind of confidence, a sort of swagger that comes from there being a lot of Jews around. So your answer about fewer is really the heart of the matter, right? Israel has that too. But if you're in Boston, or I'm bound to say in Britain, the awareness that you are really small and a little enclave really runs through everything, the jokes, sort of the way you see things. So in a way, when I saw your act here in London, your show in London, I thought I connected with that in a way that maybe, a lot of New York Jewish humor feels more remote to me because it's the sensibility of people coming from a very, very big community. Whereas you in Boston, me in London, it felt more similar and different from Israel.
I don't particularly like Jewish humor, if I'm being honest with you. I have said this to many disappointed silences in synagogue Q&As. I think it largely
it's like,
is...
do you prefer Mormon humor or like Catholic humor? What is the humor that you prefer?
Well, Mormon humor, their underwear jokes are better. And by the way, if there was a Mormon had a young man to be like, take my wife, please, I have 6 more. I'm joking. Obviously, most of them, that's a very small percentage of Mormons. But at least the Mormon experience... Sorry, I'm not going to compare it to other religions. I'm just going to say that, our Jewish humor was such a part of the growth of urban humor. It's largely become, it's formed a sort of big mass that's hard to get around. In that, a lot of Jewish humor in the United States is nostalgia focused. It's focused on a sort of shtick or a Catskillian aesthetic here's how I would sum it up. There are lots of comedians that do Jewish humor. There aren't a lot of comedians that talk about the experience of what it means to be Jewish. And so I think that one is much more important than the other. Jonathan, Rabbi Lord Sachs, Jonathan Sachs is my favorite writer on Judaism, said that the only possible cure for anti-Semitism, he would often offer the caveat that anti-Semitism is not an ill that can be cured, but he said a way to possibly ameliorate it was to try to communicate to other people the experience of what it meant to be Jewish. And I've always really loved that. And I just don't know that American Jewish comedy seeks to communicate the experience of what it means to be Jewish. That isn't to say, by the way, that Mel Brooks and Larry David and Seinfeld and all those people for whom are absolute icons to me, idols, Norman Lear. I just think that right now it's tough to create stuff that is Jewish in content and aesthetic that speaks to the American Jewish experience. There are big exceptions. Nobody wants this. The marvelous Mrs. Maisel. But in stand-up comedy, I can think of only 3 or 4 comedians who do the job in the way that I sort of want to see.
So let's talk about Just For Us, if you're not tired about talking about it thus far. Because 2 things. First of all, when you talk about that experience, because it's interesting that it speaks obviously to not, we should say it's based on you crashing basically an event of neo-Nazis in Queens. And I wonder what about it speaks to large crowds that are not only in the US and obviously not only Jewish. What about that experience you think touches people?
I think it contains at its center 2 things. One, a deep desire that is somehow a wish fulfillment desire, which is that we will hear and be heard by those who hate us the most, right? Because ultimately I'm sitting there and listening to them. And there is an empathy there that Americans really, really would love to see in their counterparts on the other side. I believe that like heavily. Barack Obama will talk about pluralism to anyone who will listen. And the truth is people are not buying what he is selling, which is really a shame because he could not be at this stage in his life and career more correct. Americans actually want pluralism. They truly believe it. They have lost faith in the other side, that the other side wants that pluralism. But the truth is, I think, let's say a good 80% of Americans, I'm revising down given political events, but I think 80% of Americans want a sort of coexistence life that lets everybody progress forward. They have fundamental disagreements, deal breakers, things that are different. So yeah, I think there was that. And I also think that there was a sort of gray area tension in the show, which was, I guess that I'm white enough to get into the room, but not white enough to be considered white by the people inside of it. And so I think people were fascinated by that paradox and they wanted it. And also it had a lot of jokes in it. And there was a lot of clear narrative that was helped by people who were militant about making sure I was adhering to a clear narrative. So, yeah.
So just on the first point about the idea of listening to people with empathy, in a way you've picked the most extreme sort of test case, which is you're in a room full of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, anti-Semites, and nevertheless you manage to present them to the audience as human and to show them empathy, as if to say there's nobody that you can't empathize with. If I can manage to well, let me just get to the end of the thought. If I can manage to empathize with these people and you, the audience, will, then in a way, who in the world would you not? And I was just wondering if that is a sort of a belief of yours to the point where there's really nobody in the world that you couldn't imagine that exercise with. And obviously the most extreme example now, given we're talking a bit about Israel, Israel's involved in a mortal clash with Hamas. Could you imagine a situation, is there nobody that you couldn't sit with and find a common human ground with?
Yeah, I don't think there's anyone. I'm sorry. I feel like not naive, but I don't believe there's anyone that I wouldn't do that with or for. It's about being productive, right? I think that there is this paradox that we find ourselves in. A lot of Americans in their interpersonal relationships, which is, would you rather be right or would you rather be productive? Because if you'd rather be right, then you should just stick to your enclave. If you want to be right, then just seek out the people with whom you share the same opinion with on fundamental human issues, right? Whether they be, religious, gender-based, political. And the question is, do you remember Christopher Hitchens, Jonathan? Obviously, both of you. There is a really great clip of Christopher Hitchens on, I'm aware that I'm quoting someone who's, I think, I know had many controversial and heterodox opinions over the course of his life, some of which history will have shown to be regressive, all that stuff. Hitchens is on with Sean Hannity, and Sean Hannity asks him some question that is meant to, is sort of gotcha question on atheism. And Hitchens says, Mr. Hannity, with all due respect, and the all due respect is sort of dripping with the disrespect, with all due respect, you strike me as a type of person who has never considered the opinion of those he disagree with, or who doesn't understand the opinions of those on the other side. And I do think that Yeah, we're in a moment where if you want to be productive, you might have to actually sit down with people who you are fundamentally opposed to on the most essential issues. But that might also be my upbringing. Like, I also, like, when I look at people, sometimes I see their backgrounds and I see their motivations and their frustrations. And, like, I went knocking door to door for Kamala Harris. And it was great because we won. I went, knocking. It was amazing. I mean, I remember just not watching the news in November or since then because I just knew that we won. So it's been really unbelievable. But I went knocking door to door, and I knocked on doors which had signs that I would consider fundamentally offensive. Things, political views about people, bumper stickers on trucks. You're knocking on doors in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Minnesota, seeing people say things, hearing people say things, and like the truth is, it reflects who they are. People are the sum total of their upbringing and their fears and their priorities. And so, yeah, I don't know that there's anyone that I wouldn't sit down with.
Someone who's not funny, for example? I mean, that could be.
I mean, I'm with one of you right now, so it's won't say who it is, but Jonathan, how do you carry this?
We're all feeling it. I mean, let's just say it.
Yeah, we are. I know. I'm leaving the conversation after this question, I promise. But,
it's Jonathan. Please, it's Jonathan.
What I was wondering, and I'm again, these really putting the damper on the mood here, but is all of this story of anti-Semitism and neo-Nazism and all of this, you wrote this back in 2018? Right? Or even before that. Mm-hmm. But the world turned upside down on October 7th of 2023. It turned upside down for Israelis. It turned upside down for American Jews. Sorry. You haven't been watching television for a while, even before the elections. I get it. But I was wondering for you how that changed, how it changed you, how it changed your humor, even in a way how it changed the show. I mean, what happened since to you?
It's a good question. I mean, look, good comedy, I believe that good comedy should be conversant with the time that it's in, but not beholden to it, because it's one person's individual experience. So I addressed it at the top of the show. I had a line addressing it, but the line also let people know that I wasn't going to talk about it. And by the way, I've gotten pretty angry notes from people who went, how could you not have like adjusted your special to release it in a different time? It's inappropriate to release it in a time of such, division and hatred. Someone said, how could you center a Jewish story during a, Palestinian genocide? Things like that. People expressing their opinions on the piece itself. I did all sorts of math on it, but ultimately, I think that would have required its own show, to actually change the piece itself. I do think that all good personal comedy can be sort of a prism through which you see the world. Yeah, something dealing with Jewish identity during a time post-October 7th was weird and difficult and taxing. And I'm very wary of people who claim fear when it's not theirs to have. But doing that show in October of 2023 was pretty, I felt nervous. I felt nervous walking in the theater. I felt nervous on stage, and then I tried to put it out of my mind. And during the Q&A, some lady raised her hand and went, what if someone kills you? And I was like, well, I don't think that's very likely to happen. Wasn't likely to happen. Someone sent me like a death threat on Instagram. They're like, I'm going to come to San Francisco on October 27th and behead you in front of your Zionist buddies. And I was like, well, the show is October 26th and October 28th. So you're going to have to pick. Or maybe I'm leaving town on the 26th. I'm not going to stick around for the beheading, And also the guy I looked at it and it was like, some teenager from Tunisia. Like, I don't think he's going to get his freaking flyer miles together and, get a Delta flight to San Francisco and, buy a ticket and wait. It's so much admin.
Purpose of visit.
Yeah.
Alex Edelman.
Do you know Alex Edelman
travels this far? It really kind of deserves it. I'm just saying.
That's what I was thinking.
He made the effort, is what,
By the way, this is the type of humor that I find to be very Israeli, right? Like this sort of gallows humor. I'm not kidding. I think this gallows humor or this humor about the worst happening is, I would say, centers in a sort of Israeli motif, right? Like an Israeli comedy thing. It's the type of thing you would see from really like.
You don't think it's funny? I got it. I wrote it down. It's okay.
No, I love it.
I'm selling it to Israeli comedians.
I think I prefer an American aesthetic, which is like joke heavy, set up, punchline, all things lead to one another. But I like I like an Israeli content, which is sort of like but by the way, like, even I think my feelings about what is and isn't Israeli have changed, or my feelings about Israel have changed a lot over the last, 18 months. And even before that, by the way, if I'm being honest, like, I think that it's very hard for someone who's an avowed seer of both sides, this conflict. I think I envy the moral clarity of people who are unremittingly pro-Palestinian or unremittingly, I say pro-Palestinian in a way that doesn't, or unremittingly like Zionist, the capital Z, because like the truth is in that moral certainty, there's a comfort to being right. And I'm not interested because no one's going anywhere. Like both of these people are going to be around. So you're going to have to figure out a productive dialogue instead of a correct one. Yeah, I don't know, Jonathan. I think your question is the $1 million one.
Well, I suspect you felt that the thing about both sides and the need to see both before. So what's been the change? Because you said things have changed in the last 18 months. From what to what?
I think the people that I would see as radically centrist and thoughtful, a lot of them have dropped away to one side of the hill. I see much less productive dialogue. I see the willingness to disavow principle in the face of extreme oppressive and murderous circumstance, which is...
You think this applies to both sides?
I think it applies to people on both sides. I think that I think the problem is I truly see... I remember reading a book once where the Israeli narrative and the Palestinian and Arab narrative were on separate sides of the book. And one page you had the Israeli narrative, on the other page you had the Palestinian one. And I can't remember what it's called, but it was, I remember thinking, man, there are literally alternate histories. There are literally people living in alternate realities and being motivated by facts that come from different, that come from literally different realities, and getting these people to agree on a mutual reality is hard enough. And I think in the last 18 months, it's been a really tough time for nuance. It is not the most urgent victim of the conflict, but it certainly is one. I think the gray area has really, really dropped away as people focus on a short-term, fix, especially in the United States. I can't speak to the Israeli side or the Palestinian side, but and also it's really hard to, where are all the stories about people witnessing the humanity in others in a way that changes their opinion? That really bums me out.
Do you have arguments inside your family about this?
Huge. My brother's much more conservative than I am. Much more conservative.
Brother who we should say has a deep connection to Israel. He was
of course.
An Olympian. We can't forget this. It's an important part of your family biography.
He represented Israel in the 2018 Winter Olympics in skeleton, and he's continued to compete as a winter sports athlete. Is trying to make it in bobsled, and I won't comment on AJ's. I have one of my few personal things is I never comment on the political opinions of anyone within my family, but he's and some things I agree on and most things I do not, but there are real deep disagreements in my family. And I have cousins who are very, 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 very lefty, American cousins who are very lefty. And I have cousins who live in West Bank. And I have cousins who live in Neve Yaakov and are deeply connected to Israel. And I feel a deep connection to Israel, which is why it's so, which is why it's so painful what's happening. And I've been like, but yes, Jonathan, I've been wrestling this for a lot longer with this for a lot longer than, 18 months ago.
No, certainly. I mean, the whole skeleton thing, by the way, is just a huge... People should watch the TV version of Just For Us because it's absolutely hilarious sort of tangent. Your brother's Olympic career, which is just an amazing...
The Frozen Chosen.
The Frozen Chosen, shul runnings.
That's right.
It's a fantastic bit. But I love the whole thing. But just on the Israel-Palestine thing, as I understand it, you're not running away from this, you're running towards it. As I understand it, you're working on something which may be a show on this subject?
I mean, possibly. The thing is, the reason I have such a connection to it partially is because when I was living there, I don't know that I've talked a ton about this, at least in public, but, I lived there as a young person during a moment around the Second Intifada. I can't exactly remember when it was. I remember when I was there, King Hussein of Jordan died, and it was really actually moved. God, I haven't thought about this in a long time, but I was very moved by the outpouring of grief from Israelis for King Hussein of Jordan. I thought that was a really good example. And I was like, why isn't everybody talking? I was a child, but I remember being like, why isn't everybody talking about how remarkable this is? That this person who was a sworn enemy of Israel for a chunk of his life, who was involved in an armed conflict against Israel for a big chunk of his life, is now being celebrated and venerated as sort of. I'm sure there were pockets where that wasn't true, but
it was pretty true for the whole country. This is 1999, so you lived in Israel in where? I mean,
I was in Neve Yaakov with my cousins, and here's how close, for context, Neve Yaakov is to the sort of line, the wall or the separation fence, depending on which reality you live in. It runs through the wadi right behind Neve Yaakov, and me and my aunt would hike down into that wadi, and there would be Arab kids taking care of livestock and Jewish kids playing around with crappy electronics, and I remember and by the way, it's one of those things where I'll have to check with my parents, but it could have been months that I lived there, or it could have been a couple of weeks. It just feels like such a discrete period of time. And I remember vividly, I can't remember if I was there, but the Sbarro's pizzeria bombing. I went to the Sbarro's beforehand, so I remember this because I was like, oh God, I must have. But I remember the Sbarro's. I was 10, so there are things that I don't remember. But then when I went to study for a year in yeshiva in Jerusalem, I was close to a couple of Merkaz Harav adjacent kids, and that massacre happened while we were at school, and I went to the funeral with my roommate, Nathaniel Heiser, and I remember standing there in the crowd at this funeral, and the mayor of Jerusalem, who I think at the time had a very long name, like Lupoliansky or something like that.
That was exactly his name.
Really? Was it Uri Lupoliansky?
Yes.
I saw him at a bunch of public things, and he always looked very slightly out of his depth. He always looked a little bit terrified to be there, and I was always like, this guy feels like he became the mayor on accident or something like that. I maybe this is wrong, but I remember him as having a beard and always wearing a yarmulke. But
that's pretty much accurate.
Oh, okay. I remember him speaking.
That has to be 2008. So these are points in your, the terror attack in Yeshivat Merkaz Harav is 2008. These are all points of your life where you just encounter terror in different points of reality.
I also saw really amazing things, though. It was the first place, 2008, I was in yeshiva. It was the first time I learned for learning's sake. It's the first time I encountered Palestinians or Israeli Arabs in meaningful ways, people who had decided that they were, Israeli Arabs who considered themselves Palestinian. We'd go to East Jerusalem and sit in that hotel sometimes. And I was fascinated by the part of Jerusalem that had different windows, because East Jerusalem, the houses have different windows, or at least back then they did. It seemed like, and also maybe there was a sense of I don't know, when you're young, that the world can reach out and touch you in a serious and scary way for the first time. So I remember that from Israel, but I also somehow maneuvered my way into the Israeli presidential conference. They let someone was like, oh, this yeshiva bacher wants to come, and like I got to go watch like Václav Havel speak and Amos Oz, and and George Bush came when he was the sitting president at the time, and now it seems quaint, but he looked at the world leaders that had assembled for this conference. It was Shimon Peres's birthday conference, I think, and he said, leaders, ex-leaders. And then he went, save a seat for me in the ex-leaders club. And everybody like chuckled. And I was like, wait, don't we hate this guy? Why are we chuckling? Like it was like when you're on the ground there, on the ground, like it's Iraq in 2004 or something. But like when you're actually in Israel, or when you're actually in that part of the world, I think things take on a slightly different tint. So I'm interested in talking about it because some of those things were really traumatic and I sort of carry them with me. And some of those things are really inspiring and I sort of carry them with me too.
It's really interesting to me to hear you talk about all of these experiences it prompts two questions in my mind. The first one is, I notice a lot when you're interviewed, people say you're from a modern Orthodox Jewish background, or you grew up Orthodox Jewish, as if it's in the past tense. There's a sort of assumption that if you're now this cool Emmy-winning comedian now, you obviously can't be an Orthodox Jew now. That must just be the thing you had in your past. And I'm interested to know if for you it's in the present tense or past tense. But the second thing that's kind of related to that is, let's start with that first, and then I'll come back to the second thing.
All right, but don't let me talk for too long, because I worry that I'm talking for too long.
No, that's kind of why we want you on.
Okay, but will people edit this down so it's coherent?
Not sure people will.
Okay, fine. Michal's not gonna. All right, fine.
She might. I mean, it depends if she likes you or not. If she doesn't like you, it's snip, and it's cutting you down to 3 minutes. So it really depends.
Good, but I don't want to take up too much air here, guys. But look, Jonathan, I think modern Orthodox. I think I am modern Orthodox. I think I joke that I'm most comfortable in a less religious synagogue where I can complain about how irreligious it is.
That speaks to a big part of
Jonathan feels the same way.
What, Jonathan, you're Masorti, right?
Exactly, Masorti, and that's kind of okay. That's sort of the Goldilocks sweet spot. But I spent many years, alongside my father in synagogue, where he would always, his pleasure was to say it's either too much or not enough. And that's the pleasure. For him, it was a machaya to not be satisfied with the actual exact level. And that's a very, very niche Jewish observation. But I think
it's good that you point out this about the awards, by the way, because if you win a Grammy, they make you turn in your Orthodox Judaism. And sorry, because especially if any Grammy event falls out on Pesach, they put kitniot in front of you, and they're like, "You got to eat it right now. Eat it. Eat the beans." And you're like, "But I'm not Sephardi," and they're like, "Doesn't matter. Eat them." Lady Gaga did it. She was a rabbi from deepest Brooklyn before this, And now look at her. She's wearing treif on her. She's wearing treif on her shoulders, But yeah, I love my modern Orthodox upbringing. It informs everything about me. The seeking of the middle, the desire to witness everyone in their experience. The feeling that
you just said upbringing again, so goes to my point about whether it was a childhood thing that you are no longer living.
I'm still being raised, Jonathan.
Yeah, you are that young, aren't you? It's true.
I'm 30. I'm 36, and probably by the time this comes out. But the truth is, I consider myself a modern Orthodox Jew. I would balk at any other denominational label. I'm certainly not Reform or conservative or conservadox, even though it's possible that one of those labels is closer to my level of observance now. I like the rigorousness of modern Orthodoxy as it applies to both the modern world and the Orthodox one. And so for me, that's a viewpoint. It's not a level of datidness. That's like, it is, what do you value? And by the way, like, there are things, also, there's a big part of me that's like, well, one day I won't have to perform on Shabbos. One day I'll be able to, sit with my kids and make them read responsively the same verses I hated reading responsively when I was their age. My kids are going to have the same miserable, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to marry a Christian and raise my kids Muslim just to make everyone just thrilled. My kids are going to daven shacharis 3 times a day in the exact direction of Mecca. That is what's going to happen. They're going to have to...
That sounds like a plan.
Point of clarification, by the way, you don't daven shacharis 3 times a day. I need to specify that, or I'll lose my modern Orthodox cred. Thank you very much.
Some of us did notice that, Alex, and we're being judgmental quietly and enjoying the feeling. We enjoyed the feeling, some of us. So let me just...
I went to a reform school. I'm like sitting mocking you people. Okay.
Hey, what's the difference between... I've got such a mean joke.
Go to the mean joke.
Go ahead.
I'm aware this joke is mildly offensive. I really love it a lot. What's the difference between Donald Trump and a reform rabbi?
I fear to ask.
Donald Trump has Jewish grandchildren.
Oh, man, that's mean. That is mean. Let's go back to your kids praying for Mecca.
Very, very funny.
Of course.
That's very, very good. And vicious, of course, and we did disavow.
We abhor it. We completely.
I disavow the joke too. I think the joke is really offensive. And
no, but you've delivered it. No, here's the thing I was going to ask you about, which is flowing out the thing about how you identify now, which is, I heard you saying somewhere that you were, and I think, that's interesting as well, whether you've moved, something of an anti-Semitism minimalist, which I think is a brilliant description. And I think, I would have some common ground with that, meaning you're not somebody who wants to make victimhood central to Jewish identity. And in fact, you're a bit worried by the fact that a lot of people do make victimhood central to Jewish identity. But I sensed in the way you talked about it, where I read you, that there was some sort of movement on that. And given what you were saying about what you saw as a young child in Israel, you've seen some stuff. I don't know where are you on that before we get to the quickfire round that I think is looming?
It's a good question. I mean, what I meant by anti-Semitism minimalist is I always thought, what does identity look like without victimhood? Right? What is your identity as a Jew look like if you're not concerned as much with the persecution of the outside world? And I also think it's an aspirational thing, right? We should aspire to... my favorite jokes address, actual issues that concern things that Jews are really concerned with, right? Like that joke I just told, that offensive joke about, has to do with like rising rates of intermarriage. You would argue that it highlights something important, right? And is the most important thing to the exclusion of all else Jewish victimhood? Is that the thing that we should be constantly discussing and concerning ourselves with? And also the oppressor-oppressee binary. Situating Jews somewhere on this axis has been really difficult and confusing for not just Jews, but almost every anti-Semite and philo-Semite in society writ large. And I think at best, it's boring, and at worst, it's dangerous. So I'm really concerned with this. And also, it's not our lens. It's like a very westernized colonialist lens that is like very new and very weird and doesn't jibe well with our worldview and prevents good works and good deeds, in my opinion. With that said, in Israel, it's impossible to divorce from this, no matter how much, anti-Semites or Jews or philo-Semites would like to. Israel is a big part of this. Now, it's impossible to divorce the two. So that's why I'm wavering on it. Jonathan, I'm currently grappling with whether or not, because there's certainly anti-Semitism on campuses. I will go to any campus. Like I perform at campuses whenever I'm offered the chance. I speak on campuses whenever I'm offered the chance. I like doing it because I like to hear directly from these younger people about their experiences. I hosted a Radio 4 show about young people for a long time. I think it's a really difficult and under-discussed time in people's lives. And so on campus, there's certainly anti-Semitism, and even someone like me who's been denying it for a long time can't help but see that for what it is. And again, not to be like on the other hand 4 or 5 times, but on the other hand, it's way better than it would have been 60, 50 years ago. You know, I had a relative, I won't say who they are because it's not my story to tell, but they were rejected from Duke Medical School because Duke had a quota for how many Jews they were willing to admit. And this is in like the 80s. It's better now. Like, people are concerned with Jewish safety. People are willing to stand up for Jews in a way that they weren't. It would be wrong not to recognize that. People are willing to try to parse between anti-Semitic speech and anti-Israel speech and have big arguments about what that is in a way that I believe to actually be good faith. Even if you argue the two can't be divorced, that discussion is still a useful discussion to see happening. So, like, I guess if I had to sum all this up, having worked it out in real time, sorry, I think that like anti-Semitism is definitely real. Obviously, there are anti-Semitic instances that happen. There are things that are attributed to anti-Semitism sometimes that can be attributed to other things that people jump at and are scared of because the Holocaust is something that still looms large in our lives. And, Holocaust-like rhetoric from anti-Semites around the world still crops up very, very regularly. And with that said, it's not a way I want to live my life. And it would be really wonderful to wonder. It'd be really wonderful to have the ability to examine your Jewish identity free of that victimhood lens.
I'm going to take us into the fluffy area of Jewish holidays. And the reason is, first of all, it's Purim, so we can do that.
Yes.
But also because I've seen all of these, you have these great riffs. They're obviously a brilliant nod to Lenny Bruce about what's Jewish and what's not. And you have this about dating apps. It appears J-Date is not Jewish. And you have this about, everything in the world. Obviously, balsamic strawberry for ice cream is goyish. We know that. That's obvious. We go through the whole thing. And I'm going into a risky place here, which is to ask you about Jewish holidays. Because I have this feeling, and it might sound weird to anyone who doesn't know your riff, but that Purim might not be Jewish.
Here's what I'll say. By the way, I never prepare anything in advance whenever anyone does Jewish, not Jewish with me. And the other thing is there are plenty of people that do Jewish, not Jewish or variations on it. And some people are very...
Yes,
I don't
but
do
you're
it
funny.
I don't do it as much anymore because other people who did variations on it started to get upset. I took it from the Lenny Bruce thing and was constantly saying it belongs to Lenny Bruce. But there was an Esquire article in the 90s. There's an online guy named Eitan who does a version of this too. But yes, I hate to disagree with you, Nate. I think Purim is a very Jewish holiday. But
how is that possible? You have to drink unconscious and do silly things and feel good about yourself. How could that be a Jewish holiday?
But the discourse around drinking is so involved and stressful and exact that if it was a non-Jewish holiday, they would just go drink. But in the Talmud, it's like, oh, you got to drink until you can't see the difference between blue and white. And someone's like, no, until you can't see the difference between blue and green. And someone's like, until you can't tell what time it is in the daytime, or until you can't tell what time it is to say Shema. Like, it's literally all the equivocating. And non-Jews would know to just enjoy themselves and drink. They'd be like, it's time to drink. They'd be like, non-Jews drink for births, they drink for deaths, they drink for weddings, they drink for funerals, like they just drink for anything. Jews, we have one holiday where they're like, hey, lighten up a little bit. And so, but we can't even do that.
Okay, miserable with losing with Purim. And everything else, obviously.
But hang on, let's go with the idea though. What of the Jewish calendar, which of the holidays stands out to you as not Jewish? Do any of them? Is there a Goyish Jewish holiday?
Yeah, there are a couple. Okay, there are a couple of non-Jewish holidays. First of all, I hate to say this, but Yom Kippur is not Jewish.
No, you can't. Okay, explain. Please explain.
Yom Kippur, it's this nakedly aspirational concept that you're going to get forgiveness from your family and friends, that a chapter is closed. Jews never close the chapter. Jews are constantly scribbling in the book of life, asking for more stuff. Rosh Hashanah is the most Jewish holiday, and Yom Kippur is the least Jewish. That's what I'll say. That Jewish New Year centered around death and forgiveness, that is on brand. But a holiday where your slate is wiped clean, your slate's not wiped clean. Because your cousin said some shit to you, and you still are never forgiving him.
Right? I would have to say, I was quite surprised you included forgiveness in the Jewish heading. I thought you were going to say we don't do that. That's not.
No. We do forgiveness, but we don't do clean slates.
Right. I remember it, but I forgive you.
Jews forgive, but they don't forget.
Correct.
That's the thing.
Nope.
Jews forgive. Jews forgive, but it's shit we like to lord over you for a while, huh?
Yeah, don't think I've forgotten.
Shavuot's not Jewish. Pesach is crazy Jewish. Hanukkah is a conservadox holiday, and it's also a little nationalist, and people are really excited to highlight the nationalism, and they like get all high and mighty about Hanukkah, a thing they never cared about before October 7th. Now everyone's like, oh, Hanukkah's my favorite holiday, and I love to talk about the nationalist implications of Hanukkah or the nationalist underpinnings or the Zionist underpinnings. Everyone's so excited to do it. Tu B'Shvat's Jewish, but Tu B'Av is not. Tisha B'Av is Jewish, but Tanis Esther is not. Okay.
You just go unpack a couple of the not. Why is Shavuot not? And why do you have to tell us why J
How is
date
it not Jewish?
Tell us why Shavuot and J date are not Jewish.
All right. That much dairy is not Jewish. A holiday where you have dairy? A milchik holiday? I'm sorry. This has got us a holiday where your family gives you the wrong type of kugel. I could. It's not right. Where you stay up all night. Shavuot. Excuse me. Jewish is 9 p.m. bedtime. Staying up all night is not Jewish.
Although Pesach, staying up late, crazy Jewish.
I mean, excuse me. Here's every Seder. You get after everything after the meal is optional. And you know it because early bedtime is Jewish. And you start a Seder at like 3 p.m. and at 10 p.m. you're barely finished the meal and you're like, all right, I'm tapping out. Not a single Jew has ever made it to Hallel. It's over. Okay?
By the way, in the Friedland family, they force you to get to the end. Don't worry.
That sounds brutal, and you guys should be absolutely.
That's definitely
no one ever makes it to Hallel.
Yeah.
Neretza, forget about it. You know what you do? You halfway through the last course of the Pesach meal, you go, does anyone want to say next year in Jerusalem? And someone does, and you're like, let's pack it up. You've heard about the goat song. You've heard about Chad Gadya, but you don't really do it.
No, we do.
Nobody really does it.
I'm putting in a discllaimer there. We do that. What is the more Jewish dating app? I'm thinking of our listeners who may want guidance.
Bumble. Bumble is the Jewish app.
Okay.
And Ashes Chayil, who makes the first move, that's what you want. Also Hinge. Hinge is Jewish. You know someone who knows someone who knows someone? That's Jewish.
We're not promoting or supporting any of these. Yeah, exactly. Well, it's Alex.
You're like, our sponsor is J-Date.
Oh, I know something I want to ask you.
Please.
Because this is just, it's slightly a comedian craft thing, but it's also a Jewish angst thing. So I read that all the big greats of current comedy, including some Jewish ones, were in the audience for Just For Us. It was such a big hit, word of mouth. Jerry Seinfeld came along. Billy Crystal was there. We love Billy Crystal very particularly on this podcast. I'm just interested to know, as a sort of practitioner, what that is like for you to be doing your show with those people in the audience. How does that
It work? Makes you wonder how the guy was able to shoot Abraham Lincoln. Because the whole time the crowd is watching them. And I was like, how good was that show? How good was Our American Cousin? The play that Lincoln was watching at Ford's Theater that people weren't like.
You're now making Lincoln? A little face, which is the audience looking at a member of the audience.
Yeah, I mean, but also, the truth is, I don't know that I've talked about this very much, but before every show I write 5 goals. And the goals are always different, but you have them in mind even when they're not on the board. And the 5 goals were, watch your tempo, or keep your runtime down. No jazz, which means less riffing, because obviously, as you can tell, I love to riff. And I don't mean some of the things that I say. I just riff them off the top of my head and hear how they sound coming out of my mouth. It's like the most fun thing in the world. And it's good for comedy, but can be bad for solo shows. And one of them was, you're just telling the story to blank. You're just telling the story to your friend who's in the audience, or my stage manager, MC, or Brian. And ultimately, when someone famous is in the crowd, you're just still telling the story to someone who's in the audience. And it's like when you tell a story at a table and who's someone you respect, Guy Penis. Guy Penis is sat on the other side of that table and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe Guy Penis is listening to me tell this anecdote. I'm just picking a random name. And you never know if someone's going to be there and it's the last comedy show they'll ever see, or it's the first comedy show they've ever seen, or it's the first show since someone in their life has died, or it's the first show, that they've been to since October 7th or since COVID ended. And so you have a responsibility to those people too. But yeah, it's stressful when someone you admire is there. And I was very gratified and agitated when people like Jerry came, or Billy, or Steve Martin, or Alan Cumming, or any of these folks that Nathan Englander is one of my professors from NYU, Darren Strauss, Zadie Smith, they all came, and I was really, really stressed out, but it's really beautiful. It's really lovely to have a thing that resonates. And it was tough, but cool.
I'm going to ask a final question because I'll be damned if I let Jonathan ask the final question on this interview. I just wonder about your parents. Obviously, you talk a lot about your father, who's a cardiologist, designed artificial hearts, and your mother, a real estate lawyer. Are they extremely proud, or do you think in their heart of hearts they wanted you to become a doctor or a lawyer?
Okay, Yodit, I'm going to come down on you rather hard on this. What
have you been doing so far?
I think I've been very generous and. Wait, have I been roasty? I wasn't roasty at all.
It was just, I'm stuck on Jonathan's more funny than I am.
No, the joke was that Jonathan's not the funny one. You're the funny one.
Exactly. That was the whole gag.
I did not get that.
That was the gag.
It was diaspora. No, it was you diaspora Jews mocking the Israeli Jews.
Excuse me.
Oh, no.
That's what it was. Go ahead.
If I'm going to be mocking a non-diaspora Jew, it's going to be Shachar Chasson, or or someone like that, or let me think, who else is Guri Alfie or something, but someone I know and like. But this is what I mean when I say I don't sometimes understand old American humor, because sometimes people will be like, do your parents want you to be a doctor or a lawyer? And I'm like, who wants their kids to be a doctor or a lawyer? My
parents.
Really? Yoni, you have one life. You're doing amazing. You're an esteemed journalist, apparently not as good as Guy Penis, but you host a podcast.
Guy Penis is going to use this. That's
he's going to say something about the podcast. Go on.
You host a podcast of decent renown. I don't really know. Didn't you interview Obama or some shit like that?
And Biden and Bush.
Okay. Yes, you interviewed presidents. Your parents want you to be what, a pediatrician in Ramat Beit Shemesh?
No, they're very proud of me, but in some place they'd also want me to be.
Why? What is this obsession? A lawyer? And what type of jerk parent wants their child to be a lawyer? No offense. You want your kid to what? Procure an Exxon station for an oil company outside of Altoona, Pennsylvania, and look over the lease to make sure it's all okay? What is this? No one should have to be a lawyer unless it's their last option, and no one should have to be a doctor unless they genuinely want to help people. It is my parents were always if you can do anything that doesn't trap you behind the desk, go do it. And I think they're just beyond thrilled that I have this outlet where I can monetize my ADHD. My parents know me better than almost anyone on the planet, and I think they know and are so happy for the general population that I don't do a job with life or death stakes. If I do something and nobody laughs, it's no problem. They just go home, or they can Google when I was funnier. If I had one of those jobs where if I fuck up, someone's life is ruined,
I'm quite with your parents on this, that I think it's our gain that we don't have to have doctor, lawyer Alex Edelman. Instead, we've got...
Nice try, Jonathan, but Yodit is my favorite, so... so screw you.
First guest who ever said that.
Yonit is my favorite, but frankly, because I think she probably knows more people. Although you probably know like David Baddiel and those folks, don't you, Jonathan? You sick British Jews all stick together. You sick Golders Green, the Golders Green Club,
the Golders Green Mafia, of course. Alex, thank you very much for coming on.
We could not think of a more perfect guest for our 200th episode. Really?
Yeah.
200?
Yep. Yes, 200.
I think my Avertimer would have been better if I'm being honest with you, but you can Maya and Asaf same time. But I'm really thrilled to, and frankly, I've had this. I say this never on podcasts, but this is so fun, and I'm so thrilled to be here. And I hope if people are still listening, they haven't been put off by how long-winded and digressive and offensive my answers are. So,
thank you so much, Alex.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach. Thank you.
Chag Sameach.
Well, he is a funny guy. That's not going to be a surprise to anybody, but really insightful too. But I'm sorry, I just have to celebrate the idea of Yom Kippur being not a Jewish festival. I think you have genuinely heard that first. That's breaking news from Unholy, I think. It has to be.
Look, he's a comic genius. We should say the whole riff on Jewish holidays, what's Jewish and what's not, we threw that in his lap. He didn't know we were going to do this. This is just something that I threw at you before we started. I said, listen, I saw him do this sort of Jewish, not Jewish about dating apps. And I saw him saying J-Date is not Jewish. And it made me think about Jewish holidays. Let's let him run with it. And he did. And he picked that up. I mean, nothing about it was prepared. And it was really the funniest thing. I mean, there are other very funny parts of it, but also some serious parts. His experiences in Israel, his experiences as a Jew in the United States. Yes. I mean, just all of it was so fascinating.
Yeah, no, he thinks really deeply about this stuff. He's funny about it. But, as the great Howard Jacobson says, comedy is a serious business. And you've got to be somebody very thoughtful to, the kind of humor he manages to generate comes from being a very, very thoughtful guy. It was a pleasure to have him on. He's definitely welcome to come back. A great way to see in Purim. Should we do a couple of our awards?
I think we should. So first of all, the Chutzpah Award, I think, can only go this week to Miri Regev. She's the transport minister. I think she's made our list once or twice before. And this time it's because of her message to, as she says, our brothers that are returning from the Hamas's captivity. And she decided, as the Minister of Transportation, to give them a waiver on driver's license fee. My heart, she says, like everyone's heart, as with the hostages, we still wish for them to come back. And this is one of the decisions that my ministry has made, including, free driving in public transport. Seriously, this is a government that under its watch, October 7th happened, under its watch, there are still Israelis in captivity. And if you think that the thing that will make them feel better is to waive their fee on driver's license, I mean, really, I think you told me this reminded you of the story we brought a few months ago. The head of the Shas, the ultra-Orthodox party, Aryeh Deri, was saying, we want to do something for Holocaust survivors still alive, and we will give them a 50% discount, I think it was, on their burial plots. I mean, you can't invent this stuff. It is pretty amazing. So that goes to her.
It really does. No contest for that one. For our Mensch Award, I thought we would do something just a tiny bit different. It may be a long time since either you or I have ourselves picked up the coloured pencils and spent time with a colouring book.
I have a 7-year-old. It's been a day since I've done that, but okay.
But you yourself doing it. I was imagining, your kids might do it, but not you. But we are encouraged, even those of us who do not have 7-year-olds, to return to the colouring book by the publication of a new one, Colour in Jewish UK. This book produced by the husband and wife team of Jeremy Weil and Emma Barnett, who will be known to British and BBC listeners as a very accomplished radio broadcaster here. The pair of them have done a whole lot of colouring books all round Britain, different areas, different neighbourhoods, but they thought there was a gap, and that was Jewish Britain. And so there are 16 landmarks and sites there, including Bevis Marks, the oldest continuing synagogue in Europe, which is here in London, but also the synagogue in Bradford, the Jaffe Fountain in Belfast, Princess Road Synagogue in Canterbury, a whole lot of Jewish sites all over the country, so that Jewish kids and perhaps others can get out the Caran d'Ache pencils. Do they still exist? I wonder. They're from my childhood. Coloured pencils and colour in Jewish life in Britain. It was unveiled at Jewish Book Week, which happened this year, I'm afraid without me because of my
I was going to say, you're
voice.
sort of the star of Jewish Book Week every year, aren't you?
Well, I had a little record of being the most continuing or recurring fixture of Jewish Book Week. I've been doing it every year, I think, for 27 years. Anyway, this year I couldn't be there, but they're going to keep the record running, I think. But anyway, it's not about me. The new book, Colour in Jewish UK, at Jewish Book Week, and it's our Mensch winner for this week.
And we are ending this show not before saying a huge thank you to Michal Porat, and we will meet next week.